I heard a popular preacher the other day say that he will not accept any theology that allows for suffering. All suffering, he says, is outside of God's will and the experiences of an obedient Christian. There are very few things that are more wrong than this absurdly non-biblical statement. Philippians 1:27-30 is one sentence in Greek, and the flow of Paul's teaching is important. He begins by encouraging the Philippian Christians to, quote, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, which means that they are to be unified, that they, quote, stand firm, staketa, in one spirit. Staketa is then modified by two participles, telling them how to stand firm by, one, striving side by side, sunathuntes, with one mind for the faith of the gospel, and two, in no way frightened, but to ruminoi by your opponents. Paul adds that their unity, quote, is a sign of destruction for them, but salvation for you, and that from God. In order to explain this, Paul moves to the point he and I want to make. Translations generally are not able to bring out the nuances of this verse, nor the awkward Greek. Paul begins, for it has been granted, echaristhe, to you on behalf of Christ. Charizomai means to give freely as a favor, to give graciously, PDAG's definition. Charizomai is a cognate verb for the familiar noun charis, meaning grace. The NLT translates, you have been given the privilege. The following are gracious gifts to Christians. One, to believe in him, ta esautan pistuein, and two, to suffer for him, ta huper autou paschein. The theology of the popular pastor denies God's gracious gift of suffering. Secondly, the awkward Greek. I'm speculating at this point, but it appears that Paul changed his mind midstream, as evidenced by the extra ta. As a note of Greek, ta paschein is an articular infinitive modified by two prepositional phrases, huper Christou and esauton. However, it seems that Paul changed his mind, probably because he wanted to encourage the Philippians at the same time, and so decided to add the phrase about God's gracious gift of faith. It would have been nice if Paul's amanuensis had scraped the ta off the parchment, but he didn't. So with this understanding, here's the phrasing. Humin echaristhe ta is your main part of this sentence, and that graciously given was huper Christou, on behalf of Christ, and then you have the umanon and the alakai construction. Not only ta esautan pistuein, not only the act of believing in him, alakai, but also ta huper autou paschein, the act of suffering for him. I've heard sermons on God's gracious gift of faith to his children. I have yet to hear a sermon on God's gracious gift of suffering. Well, that's unfortunate, to understate it in the extreme. One, when we suffer with Christ, we identify with him. We are joined in his suffering. He suffered for us, Philippians 2:8, and in turn we suffer with and for him. Two, suffering binds us together, person to person, just as suffering joins the Philippians to Paul, a point he's going to make in verse 30. Three, suffering strengthens our faith as we see that our faithfulness in the midst of suffering purifies our faith and confirming that we are truly his children. Peter says that suffering comes, quote, so that the genuineness of your faith, which is more precious than gold that perishes, having been tested by fire, may be found to your praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Fourthly, suffering provides us with an opportunity to, quote, shine like stars in the universe. As we are faithful, we show ourselves to be, quote, blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, a point that Paul is going to make in the next chapter of Philippians. Grudem defines grace as, quote, God's goodness towards those who deserve only punishment. Not only is belief a gracious gift from God, but so also is entering into suffering on his behalf. To deny the reality and the gift of suffering is to rip out half of God's gracious gifts to us that Paul's talking about. I understand that we don't tend to look forward to suffering as followers of Jesus, but our conversion necessarily puts us at odds with the world, and changed people will and must live changed lives. In fact, if we are not suffering, then we need to ask if we are living out our allegiance to Christ. Paul has just said that our separation from the world, specifically our unity in Christ, quote, is a sign of destruction to them, but of salvation for you. That is how different we are to be from the world. What is a confirming sign of true faith in Christ serves, at the same time, as a sign of judgment on the unbelieving world. Our unity in the face of persecution and suffering is a dual sign of their destruction and our salvation. But if we are not suffering, how are we different from the world? The fact of the matter is that much of the Western Church knows little of suffering, since we are not that different from the world. Have you heard that old saying, if Christianity became illegal, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Well, we must be different. We were changed at the gate. Of course, we're going to live a life that is different from those on the wide open, easy street headed straight to hell. Matthew 7:13 and 14. Suffering for Christ is so essential that without it, one's salvation is in question. By the way, I am reformed in my theology. As Paul tells the Romans, quote, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ. And we love to stop the sentence there, but Paul doesn't. He continues that we are God's children, his heirs, fellow heirs with Christ, quote, provided we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. Romans 8:16 and 17. Our glorification depends upon our suffering. And our suffering depends upon our willingness to be God's special people, salt and light, standing in stark contrast to the darkness of the world. Suffering for Christ as we live out our lives is a gracious gift from God, confirming and strengthening his gracious gift of faith to us. As Fee writes, and he's quoting Lightfoot, suffering should not surprise or overwhelm them, the Philippians. It is rather evidence that, quote, God looks upon you with favor. I am convinced that if the modern church actually was unified, standing firm in one spirit, and if it actually did strive side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel, then we would be living in sharp contrast to the world, suffering for it, and be joined with Christ through it. Anyone who teaches otherwise is teaching a false doctrine and is robbing God's children of the joyful benefits of suffering.